In the autumn of 1996, Kansas farmer Harold Whitlow left his north pasture near dusk, saying he would check the irrigation lines before supper. He never returned. His wife, Martha, called the sheriff that night. Deputies found his pickup still running beside the barn, headlights cutting across the rows, a thermos of coffee half full on the seat. No wallet, no hat, no body. Neighbors whispered about debts and deals gone bad. One farmhand remembered late-night meetings in the machine shed, envelopes passed hand to hand, and ledger pages filled with initials instead of names. A teller at the small-town bank recalled Harold withdrawing large sums in cash, always looking over his shoulder. Investigators gathered scraps, a torn shirt caught on a barbed fence, a receipt for seed written in a trembling hand, and boot prints leading toward the county road before vanishing in dust. The trail went cold, the case shelved, the family left with silence. For a decade, nothing stirred, until Harold's son pried open a corner of the old barn. Inside, under sacks of feed, he found the hidden ledger that rewrote everything the community thought they knew. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The evening of September 17, 1996, pressed down over the Kansas plains with a heavy stillness. The Whitlow farm sat at the edge of a two-lane county road, hemmed in by fields of soybeans that rustled under the last hints of daylight. Harvest had dragged late that year, the ground damp from unexpected storms, leaving tractors idle and furrows clogged with silt. From the kitchen window, Martha Whitlow could see her husband Harold, walking the yard with his hands tucked into the straps of his overalls, moving slow as if measuring each step against the encroaching dark. He was 52, broad-shouldered from decades of labor, his gait steady but slowed by wear. They had eaten supper early that night, fried potatoes, beans, bread still warm from the oven. Martha remembered Harold setting down his fork, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and muttering that he would check the irrigation lines once more. The words were plain, a farmer's habit, nothing unusual. But he did not carry his hat from its hook by the door, nor his jacket, though the air carried the chill of approaching autumn. Martha asked if he would be long. He shook his head, pressed a hand to the doorframe, and stepped out into fading light. The Ford pickup idled near the barn. Its headlights cut a bright lane across the gravel, glinting off rusted implements stacked in the shadows. Harold slid behind the wheel, then paused, as if reconsidering. Instead of driving into the field, he left the engine running and walked across the rows, his outline swallowed by dusk. The soybeans bent with his passage, then straightened again, erasing all sign he had gone that way. By 8:30 p.m., the kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. Martha looked out across the fields and saw only the glow of the truck's lamps. She poured coffee into a thermos lid, set it by the sink, and waited. When the silence stretched, she called down the hallway to her son. David, 20, answered groggily from his room. The two stepped onto the porch, their shoes crunching the gravel, eyes straining across the dark. The truck remained in place. Its engine hummed low, exhaust curling into the night. The driver's door stood open, swinging with the breeze. Inside, the bench seat bore Harold's thermos, lid unscrewed, half filled with steaming liquid. His cap lay folded on the dashboard, unusual for a man who never left it behind. The keys jangled faintly with each sway of the open door, but Harold himself was gone. Martha's voice wavered when she called his name, the syllables carried by wind across open acres. No answer returned. David jogged the fence row, shining a weak flashlight over the posts, while Martha's beam swept the grass near the barn. Beyond the reach of their light, the fields rolled outward into black. By 10 p.m., Martha phoned the sheriff's office. A deputy arrived 30 minutes later, tires crunching the gravel, spotlight raking over the barn walls. 2 more units followed, red and blue lights pulsing against corrugated tin. The sheriff himself, Clyde Danner, stepped out with a clipboard and took the initial report. He asked routine questions, noting Harold's age, build, and last known movements. His tone suggested a man weary of similar calls. The search began at once. Flashlights cut across the yard. One deputy led a hound straining at its leash. The dog followed a path past the barn, nose low, until it reached the northern fence line. There it stopped, circled once, and sat, refusing to advance. The ground there showed a boot impression pressed deep into damp soil. The tread was heavy, unfamiliar, wider than Harold's own size. Danner bent, squinted, and made a quick sketch on his notepad. No plaster cast was taken. Near midnight, wind rattled the barn doors. Inside, dust danced through the beams of torchlight. Stacks of burlap sacks leaned precarious against the wall. Shelves sagged under years of tools, twine, and records. On one shelf rested a plain brown ledger, its leather cracked with age. The deputies glanced at it once, assumed farm accounts, and passed it by. Their focus remained on the ground, where another deputy found a scrap of flannel snagged in barbed wire. The cloth, blue and faded, fluttered with each gust, its edges torn. Martha recognized the pattern as similar to one of Harold's old shirts. David pressed to know what it meant, but Danner hushed him, saying the detail would be logged. He wrote, "Cloth fragment collected in block letters and tucked it into an evidence bag." When Martha asked if foul play was suspected, the sheriff's answer was flat. No signs of struggle, likely voluntary departure. By 2 a.m., the search wound down. Deputies stamped their boots against the cold, lamps flickering low. They marked Harold as missing, entered the report, and closed their notebooks. No further canvass was ordered, no extended search party called. Trucks idled briefly, then one by one departed down the road, leaving the Whitlow farm in silence once more. When dawn broke, the truck's battery had drained. Its headlights glowed dull, then died. A thin mist hung low across the rows, turning the fields pale and distant. Martha stood by the porch rail with her son beside her. They watched the barn doors shift in the wind, opening to reveal shadowed shelves and dust. The ledger still rested in place, overlooked, a mute object among many. The case file for that night, written in Sheriff Danner's hand, concluded with a single line, "Subject missing, presumed voluntary." It was the final official word on Harold Whitlow for nearly a decade. The truck keys lay abandoned in the ignition, cold metal dulled by dust. Morning rose across the Kansas plains with pale light filtering through haze. The Whitlow farm sat unnervingly quiet. Martha kept the porch light on, though the sun was already above the horizon. The Ford pickup still waited near the barn. Engine dead, keys in the ignition, cap folded on the dash. To her, it looked like an altar to absence. By 8 a.m., neighbors had arrived, word of Harold's disappearance moving fast through the small township. Trucks lined the gravel shoulder, men in denim jackets leaning against their fenders, speaking in hushed voices. They walked the fields in wide sweeps, boots pressing down rows of beans, calling Harold's name with each turn. The echo never returned. David moved through the barn, anger building with each pass. He checked the feed room, the hayloft, even the rafters. He opened drawers that had not been touched in years. His eyes caught on the ledger, its cover cracked, but he set it aside as irrelevant, the act of a son not yet ready to attach weight to the mundane. Instead, he kicked through dust and old burlap, searching for some overlooked clue. The sheriff returned at mid-morning, speaking to Martha at the kitchen table. His report was calm, steady, too practiced. He said Harold might have walked away under stress, perhaps overwhelmed by debts. He reminded her that adults had the right to leave if they wished. Martha listened in silence, hands folded over the checked tablecloth. The sheriff's words sounded less like possibilities and more like conclusions. Deputies logged their sweep of the north fence line. They measured the boot print again, but still chose not to cast it. A note in the file recorded, "Single impression, no continuity." Nearby, the torn flannel scrap dangled on barbed wire. It had been bagged and tagged the night before, its absence now marked only by frayed threads clinging to the metal. By noon, search dogs were brought again. They traced Harold's scent from the barn to the fence, then lost it. Handlers reported the dog circling without direction, unable to regain the trail. The field beyond stretched flat, interrupted only by a line of utility poles and the shimmer of distant heat. If Harold had crossed, he left no sign visible to eye or hound. In town, the story began to spread. At the grain elevator, men spoke of Harold's long-standing frustrations. Poor harvests, equipment in need of repair, notes coming due. At the diner, women whispered over a coffee that he had been seen meeting men in trucks late at night. Men not from around here. Rumor filled the absence left by fact. David bristled at the gossip. He insisted to anyone who asked that his father would never abandon family or farm. He rode into town that evening, stapling flyers to telephone poles, his handwriting bold and uneven. The flyer bore Harold's photograph. Square jaw, cap tilted forward, eyes steady against the glare of sun. The caption read, "Missing since September 17th. Beneath, a phone number scratched in pen. Martha kept to the house. She moved from window to window, glancing toward the barn, waiting for headlights that would never return. Each room echoed with the absence of Harold's voice. She left his boots by the door, mud still clinging to the soles from his last walk across the field. Late that night, David returned exhausted. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the sheriff's card, unsure whether to call again. He muttered about the search ending too soon, about neighbors fading back into their routines. Martha pressed a hand to his arm, but offered no words. The silence hung heavier than comfort. The official record for that day closed with a single sentence. Further searches yielded no discovery. The line left no space for hope or doubt, just a fact recorded in ink. For the family, it was not enough. In the barn, the ledger still rested untouched, dust gathering across its surface. No one yet imagined it would one day be pried open as the key to everything. Flashlights combed the fields long into the night, beams sweeping the horizon, but the land remained mute. When the last light winked out, the Whitlow farm lay again in darkness. The flashlight beam caught only an empty fence line and silence. Autumn days shortened quickly in Kansas. By the third week after Harold's disappearance, the air had turned sharper, leaves along the hedgerows beginning to yellow. Life on the farm continued with aching slowness. Tractors rumbled across fields. Neighbors checked their herds. Children gathered at the school bus stop each morning. Yet the Whitlow place remained under a hush. The absence lingered like a second weather. Sheriff Clyde Danner filed his official report with a detached cadence. He had handled missing person cases before, teenagers slipping off to the city, drifters passing through, an old ranch hand who wandered drunk into a creek bed. He insisted to Martha that Harold's situation was no different. On paper, the file carried simple notations. Adult male, 52, no foul play suspected, voluntary absence possible. The file was stamped and slid into a drawer. The heading above it read, "Inactive." David found that word intolerable. He pressed the sheriff's office repeatedly for renewed searches, but deputies shook their heads. They said too many days had passed. If Harold had wanted to be found, he would have left clearer signs. They pointed again to the truck left running by the barn, the thermos half full, the keys still in place, suggesting haste, but not violence. The farm community began filling in the silence with speculation. At the grain elevator, a trucker claimed Harold had taken loans he could not repay. In town, a clerk muttered that he had been seen arguing with a man near the co-op store 2 weeks before he vanished. At the diner, rumors grew sharper. Whispers of gambling debts, whispered names with no proof. Each voice added another layer to the fog. Martha endured it quietly. She walked the rows of beans herself, checking irrigation lines, hauling buckets. Her face grew lined from work and from listening. She still set Harold's plate at supper, only to clear it untouched each night. David's anger found focus in scraps of evidence overlooked. He returned to the barbed fence where the shirt fragment had been recovered. The wire still bore faint threads, overlooked in the rush. He held them between his fingers until they snapped. He studied the muddy print near the barn door, by now trampled by others. The impression seemed broader, deeper. inconsistent with his father's own boots. David wrote these details into a notebook, though no deputy asked for them. Weeks stretched into months. By December, snow blanketed the yard. The truck sat unmoved, battery drained, tires half deflated. A crust of frost covered the windshield each morning. Still, the sheriff insisted the matter was closed until new information appeared. He told reporters it was likely Harold had left by choice, a man under pressure making a private decision. Martha held the paper in her hand, the words cold. To her, Harold's face in the missing person photo stared back stubbornly, as if daring the print to deny him. She placed the clipping in her Bible, folding the edges sharp. The barn became a place she avoided. Its rafters creaked in winter wind. The shelves sagged under tools, twine, and the brown ledger left where Harold had last placed it. Dust gathered steadily across its spine. Each time David entered, his eye lingered on it briefly, but his mind dismissed it as bookkeeping, irrelevant against the greater question of his father's absence. The year closed without ceremony. On the county's official ledger, Harold Whitlow remained one of many names marked as missing, presumed voluntary. In coffee shops and at church pews, his name carried another meaning. A man who walked away from duty, from family, from the hard soil he had tilled. The whisper cut deeper than any report. In January, Martha stopped answering questions. She closed the curtains at dusk and lit only the kitchen lamp. David, restless, returned to college, unable to withstand the weight of stillness. The farm endured on silence, the barns heavy with shadows, the fields waiting for spring. In the courthouse basement, the file rested inside a drawer stamped inactive. The only objects listed within: a shirt scrap, a photograph of a boot impression, a line noting keys in ignition. No ledger, no further trace. The drawer shut with a metallic click, leaving the record sealed. The sheriff's drawer closed, its label reading only inactive. The seasons turned over the Whitlow farm as if time itself wished to cover what had happened. By spring of 1997, the soybeans rose again in neat rows, and tractors cut their patterns across the fields. Neighbors stopped by less often, their conversations drifting back to weather and crops. The talk of Harold's disappearance remained, but now as background, softened with each telling until it became just another story among many. Martha carried on with quiet determination. She woke before dawn, set coffee to boil, and moved through the chores Harold once shouldered. She stacked feed, checked irrigation ditches, and mended fences. Her hands toughened, her back bent slightly more each season. Yet each evening she paused on the porch, gazing toward the barn, waiting for headlights that never came. David returned only during breaks from college. He worked long hours beside his mother, restless in his movements. He questioned neighbors again, pressing for details they had long dismissed. A truck passing late at night, a stranger seen in town? But most shrugged, saying memory had grown faint. For them, Harold's absence had already been woven into the fabric of normal life. The sheriff's office had moved on. New cases filled their files: accidents, disputes, burglaries. Harold's folder gathered dust in the drawer, the ink on its cover fading. The shirt fragment and photograph of the boot print remained sealed in evidence bags, but no one revisited them. Deputy Ortega mentioned once that the soil samples had never been processed, but by then budgets were tight and interest low. Inside the barn, the air grew heavy with heat by summer. Dust coated every beam, mice rustled in the grain sacks, and swallows nested under the rafters. The ledger still sat untouched on the shelf, its spine darkened by grime, its presence forgotten amid tools and clutter. It was an ordinary object, one of dozens, and no one thought to open it. Neighbors began to speak of Harold in the past tense. They speculated he had left to escape debts or responsibilities. Some said he might be living under another name in another state. Martha refused to join these conversations. She still set out his plate at Sunday dinner, clearing it at dusk without comment. Silence had become her answer to rumor. The farm itself bore the weight of absence. Weeds crept higher along the fence lines. Machinery rusted in place. Without Harold's steady hand, the land faltered. Grain yields dropped, bills stacked. Martha sold off one parcel to keep afloat, a decision that tore at her but left no alternative. On quiet nights, David would walk the property, retracing his father's last steps. He followed the line of posts to the north fence, stared at the barbed wire where the shirt had been caught, and imagined the moment Harold disappeared. Each time he returned to the barn, he cast a glance at the ledger, but always turned away. The object remained only part of the background, an echo unnoticed. By the year 2000, the community spoke of the Whitlow disappearance as a closed matter. It was treated as cautionary, a reminder that debts and droughts could break a man. No further questions were asked. The sheriff, now older, admitted to Martha in passing that some cases never resolved. His voice carried no regret, only weariness. For Martha, the years eroded certainty. At times she thought Harold had chosen to leave. At others she believed someone had taken him. But the land itself gave no answers. Each furrow, each post, each path across the soil remained mute. In 2004, David returned home permanently. College had ended, work opportunities elsewhere had failed, and the farm still demanded hands. He settled back into routines, working side by side with Martha. Together, they endured another cycle of planting, harvest, and waiting. The barn remained full of shadows, its shelves sagging, the ledger hidden beneath burlap sacks and forgotten seed catalogs. By 2006, a decade had passed since Harold's vanishing. Martha's hair had silvered. David's shoulders broadened with labor. The sheriff retired, his files left to his successor. And still, the case file remained unopened, tucked deep in the drawer. Storm winds rattled the barn windows one evening in late autumn. David stood in the doorway, lantern raised, watching dust spiral in the beam of light. He noticed the shelf sagging with weight, a stack of burlap sliding to the floor. Behind it, the brown ledger shifted, half revealed, its cracked cover catching the glow. He reached toward it but pulled his hand back, telling himself it was nothing but old farm accounts. He left it there, closed the door, and walked back into the night. The empty barn window rattled endlessly in the storm wind. The autumn of 2006 carried with it the sharp scent of harvested fields. The soil turned and exposed under lowering skies. David worked late in the barn, stacking feed and clearing clutter, determined to put the farm back in order before winter. He shifted burlap sacks that had sagged for years, dust spilling across the floor in thick clouds. Behind them, he found the brown ledger he had glimpsed months before, its spine cracked, leather brittle with age. He pulled it into the lantern light and brushed away the dust. The cover bore no title, only faint scratches where fingers had worn the surface smooth. Curiosity overcame hesitation. He opened it. The first pages held careful handwriting, his father's script he had not seen in 10 years. Neat lines of dates, initials, and numbers stretched across the paper, each column marked with sums of money. Some entries carried notations in the margins, abbreviations and symbols that meant nothing to David at first glance. The ink had faded but remained legible, the stroke steady until the final pages, where the hand grew uneven. David carried the ledger into the house and set it on the kitchen table. Martha came from the back room, her apron dusted with flour, and froze when she saw it. She placed her hand on the cover without opening it, as if touching Harold's handwriting might conjure him back. David turned the pages slowly, both of them leaning over the book. Certain entries drew their eyes immediately. On July 3, 1995, RC, $1,200. On October 19, 1995, RC, $850. And again, repeated in varying amounts through 1996. Initials always the same, some shifting. Other names appeared in shorthand: neighbors, merchants, men from the co-op. Each entry bore Harold's penmanship. Yet the pattern spoke of debts and repayments hidden from sight. One final entry chilled David. September 17, 1996, the day his father vanished. The line read, "Meeting 9:15 p.m., North Pasture." No amount recorded, no initials following. Only that brief, stark phrase. The ink trailed unevenly, as if the pen had faltered. Martha pressed her lips together. She whispered that Harold had not spoken of debts that large, nor of meetings after dark. She insisted he would have told her. David flipped back to the earliest entries and found smaller amounts, neat balances. Over time, the sums grew. The handwriting pressed deeper into the paper as though the weight of obligation bore down. At midnight, David laid the ledger open on the table and fetched his notebook. He copied the entries, determined to find patterns. He circled each appearance of the initials RC. He marked the dates and noted how the payments coincided with known harvest times and equipment failures. He realized that Harold had been paying out cash in steady increments, always larger near season's end. The forensic edge of the discovery came clear when David compared handwriting. He retrieved old bank statements, kept in a folder in Harold's desk. The signatures matched the ledger exactly. Same slant, same looping strokes on the capital H. It was proof his father had written the book himself, not planted by another hand. But the final line, "Meeting 9:15 p.m., North Pasture," stood apart, its letters jagged, pressure uneven. By morning, David drove into town to speak with retired Deputy Ortega. He laid the ledger before him. Ortega adjusted his glasses and read the pages slowly. He tapped the final entry with a blunt finger and frowned. He said the initials RC had once surfaced in quiet talk about farm loans and collections, whispers tied to a co-op officer who extended credit off the books. Ortega admitted he had heard Harold's name linked to those whispers. But at the time, the sheriff had dismissed them as rumor. David felt both vindicated and unsettled. For 10 years, they had endured silence. Now the ledger sat in his hands, pages that tied Harold to debts, meetings, and initials repeating like a drumbeat. The book had waited in plain sight, dismissed as clutter. That night, David placed the ledger back on the kitchen table. He and Martha read it again under the lamp's glow, each line deepening the sense of a secret life carried under their roof. The ledger no longer seemed ordinary. It had become a voice returned, speaking in numbers, initials, and a final appointment never kept. The last line waited, its ink uneven. Meeting, 9:15 p.m., North Pasture. The ledger never left the kitchen table. Its cracked leather binding absorbed lamplight each evening as David bent over its pages, charting numbers against calendars. Martha kept her distance at first, her hands busy with dishes or sewing. But each night she drifted closer, finally sitting beside him, eyes following the pen strokes of her husband's long-dead handwriting. The book felt alive, a presence in the house. David copied the entries onto fresh paper, drawing columns, circling the initials RC. Each appearance matched weeks when Harold had withdrawn cash. David drove to the small-town bank and asked for archived records. A clerk retrieved boxes of microfilmed slips. Under magnification, David found Harold's signature across withdrawal slips. July 3rd, October 19th, January 6th. The amounts aligned precisely with the ledger. Proof linked the private notebook to official documents. The more David studied, the more he noticed differences in the final entries. The letters sagged, as though written in haste. Pressure cut deeper into the paper, ink blotted. A forensic handwriting guide borrowed from the library suggested tension, hesitation. One smudge stood out at the back cover, a blurred oval of grease or sweat. Under light, it reflected differently than surrounding marks. David remembered Ortega mentioning fingerprints and lifted the book carefully, wrapping it in wax paper. He drove to Ortega's home, a small bungalow on the edge of town. Ortega, older now and long retired, squinted through thick glasses as David showed the ledger. He turned the pages, nodding slowly. "That's Harold's hand, no doubt," he said. When David pointed to the smudge, Ortega frowned. "That isn't his," he murmured. His tone carried the weight of experience, though he admitted he had no way to test it himself. He suggested David take it to the new sheriff, but warned that reopening old cases required leverage. That night, Martha joined David at the table. She pressed her hand over one page, reading silently. When she lifted her hand, David noticed faint pencil marks at the bottom margin. A number barely visible, almost erased. 555-9034. David dialed from the landline. The call rang, then cut to a dead tone. No name, no answer. He wrote the number beside the entry for September 17th. The ledger's hold grew stronger. Martha confessed she had once overheard Harold arguing in the yard late at night, voices low but tense. She had thought it was a neighbor. The date, she realized, matched one of the larger payments in the ledger. David underlined it. By the third week, David contacted reporter Nina Halsey from the county paper. She agreed to meet at the farmhouse. Nina brought a camera and voice recorder. She photographed the ledger under bright light, capturing each page, each notation. She noted the initials RC, asked about the family's recollections, and promised to search archives for names that matched. Meanwhile, Ortega made a quiet call to a contact still inside the sheriff's office. Days later, David received an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a photocopy of the original evidence log from 1996. It listed items recovered at the scene. One flannel shirt scrap, one boot impression sketch, keys in ignition. Nothing mentioned a ledger. David stared at the photocopy, realization hardening. The ledger had been overlooked completely, dismissed as clutter. For a decade, it had rested in the barn, while rumors painted his father as a deserter. Now it was proof, perhaps not of what happened that night, but of the pressure Harold had lived under. The forensic path of the discovery was undeniable. Handwriting matched to withdrawals, fingerprint smudge inconsistent, penciled phone number traced to a disconnected line. Each piece sharpened the mystery, each fragment pressing toward a hidden confrontation in the north pasture. Martha folded the ledger shut at midnight. Her voice was steady, almost detached. "It waited for us," she said. "All these years." David left it on the table, the lamplight glinting on the cracked cover. The book felt heavier than its size, a weight neither of them could set aside. The penciled number lingered faint at the bottom margin, refusing to fade. The winter of 2006 crept in hard, wind cutting across the plains, rattling the loose siding of the Whitlow barn. David rose each morning to frozen ground, his breath visible in the dim kitchen light. The ledger remained on the table, pages splayed as if it had taken up permanent residence. Every night he returned to it, marking connections, underlining dates, circling the initials RC, until the letters glowed red with ink. Nina Halsey arrived one evening with a stack of printouts. She had searched through county property filings and co-op membership rosters. The name Ronald Cray surfaced repeatedly, tied to loan agreements and late fee collections. He had been an officer at the local farm supply cooperative during the years leading up to Harold's disappearance. Nina slid the papers across the table to David. "RC," she said simply. David studied the ledger again. The initials matched exactly, always tied to amounts in hundreds or thousands. Some entries ended with a dash, as though Harold intended to fill in more detail later. On 3 dates, the ledger listed only RC, with no payment recorded. One of them was September 17th, 1996, the night Harold vanished. He brought the information to Ortega. The retired deputy listened carefully, jaws set tight. He remembered whispers in the mid-1990s about Cray extending credit under the table, pressing farmers with inflated interest. None of it had been proven. Sheriff Danner, Ortega admitted, had ordered the matter set aside. David asked if Ortega would testify to that now. Ortega said he would, if it came to that. The forensic thread deepened when Nina contacted a handwriting analyst in Wichita. She forwarded copies of the ledger and withdrawal slips. The analyst's report returned 2 weeks later. Handwriting consistent across documents, beyond reasonable doubt. Final entries display tremor consistent with duress. The words struck David as cold proof of pressure closing in on his father. Meanwhile, David traced the penciled phone number. Old directories linked it to a business line once registered to Cray's office at the co-op. The number had been disconnected in 1997. David held the ledger open to the page, finger pressing the faint digits. The link, undeniable. Martha sat silently through these discoveries. She baked bread, cleaned, moved through the rituals of the household, but her eyes drifted to the ledger each time she passed the kitchen. She had begun to dream of Harold again, waking with his voice echoing faintly, always unfinished sentences. By February, David took the ledger to the courthouse, requesting the case be reopened. The new sheriff glanced at it but spoke cautiously. He said there was no new physical evidence of foul play, only financial notes. He agreed to file it but warned that without corroboration, nothing would move forward. David left frustrated, the weight of the book heavier in his arms. That night, Nina suggested taking the story public. A feature in the county paper might pressure officials. David hesitated, fearing retaliation, but the ledger itself seemed to demand exposure. He agreed. The article appeared on March 3, 2007 under the headline, "Ledger of Missing Farmer Raises New Questions." It detailed Harold's debts, the initials RC, and the final entry. The fallout was immediate. Some neighbors rallied to support the Whitlows, insisting Harold had been wronged. Others turned suspicious, accusing David of smearing reputations. Cray himself appeared at the diner, slamming the paper onto the counter, declaring he had nothing to do with Harold's vanishing. His voice carried, his fists clenched, but his denials rang hollow. Later that week, David found an envelope tucked under the farmhouse door. Inside was a prepaid phone SIM card, wrapped in masking tape. On the tape, block letters read, "Ask the warehouse." David turned it over in his palm, unsettled. The SIM card showed recent pings near an abandoned warehouse on the county's edge. Ortega urged caution, but David pocketed it. The ledger now stood at the center of everything: family artifact, community scandal, and investigative lead. Its pages had shifted from dusty record to accusatory voice. Each line carried Harold's hand, each notation pressed deeper into the soil of the farm's history. David left the kitchen light burning that night. The ledger remained open to September 17th, the words sharp in lamplight. Meeting 9:15 p.m., North Pasture. The prepaid SIM rested beside the ledger, cold plastic against cracked leather. The article had stirred something long dormant. Neighbors who once kept quiet now spoke in lowered tones, glancing over their shoulders before sharing fragments. A retired co-op clerk admitted she had seen Harold arguing with Ronald Cray in the parking lot weeks before the disappearance. Another farmer recalled hearing the slam of a truck door by the North Pasture fence after dark. Each account was partial, vague, but together they created a map of unease pointing back toward the same man. Cray himself grew louder. He barked denials at the diner, dismissed Nina's reporting as sensational, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition when David confronted him directly outside the co-op building. David held the ledger in his hands, open to a page heavy with RC entries. Cray refused to look down at the paper. Instead, he turned away, muttering threats under his breath as he climbed into his truck. The taillights bled red across the gravel as he sped off. The sheriff, pressed by public calls, requested forensic review of the shirt scrap recovered in 1996. For a decade, it had lain in an evidence bag inside the courthouse basement. Now it was shipped to a regional lab. Weeks later, the results returned. The DNA profile was male, but not Harold's. It matched no one in the state database, but its mere existence proved another presence at the fence line the night Harold vanished. David stared at the report, hands trembling. For years, the family had endured whispers that Harold left on his own. Now there was scientific confirmation that someone else had been there. He placed the lab printout beside the ledger on the kitchen table. The two pieces aligned like puzzle fragments. Debts recorded in Harold's hand, and the trace of another man at the scene. Nina expanded her reporting. She filed records requests, uncovering that several farmers in the county had also carried debts marked quietly in Cray's name. Two described being pressured to pay in cash after dark, in locations away from the co-op office. The sums matched the structure of Harold's ledger. Patterns emerged, a shadow economy moving through fields and barns, enforced not by contracts but by intimidation. At the farmhouse, Martha listened without comment. She sat by the window, fingers turning the edge of a dish towel, as David and Nina mapped names and dates across a sheet of butcher paper. Each new account felt like another nail into certainty. Ortega visited, shaking his head. "We should have pressed harder in '96, he admitted. His voice was low, heavy with regret. As tension mounted, threats followed. An anonymous note arrived one night, slipped through the barn slats, written in block letters. "Stop digging, or you'll join him." David found it while feeding the livestock. The paper smelled faintly of oil, its edges damp from dew. He carried it inside, placed it on the table beside the ledger, and photographed it. Nina published the image in her next article. The community fractured. Some neighbors urged David to let the past rest, fearing violence. Others urged him to push harder, to bring light where silence had reigned. Church pews buzzed with arguments. The Whitlows, once seen as victims of tragedy, now stood in the center of a storm. The ledger had shifted again in meaning. No longer simply Harold's record, it was now a weapon, an artifact that tied initials to sums, dates to disappearances, and silence to complicity. Each page turned became another strike against Cray's denials. By late summer, Cray faced formal questioning. He sat stiff in a courthouse office, a lawyer at his side. The sheriff placed the ledger on the table, open to September 17th. Cray glanced once, lips pressed tight, then folded his arms and refused to answer further. The session ended without confession, but the silence itself carried weight. That night, David locked the ledger inside a metal box, afraid of what might follow. He carried the box to his room, setting it beneath his bed, the key tied to his wrist. The farmhouse grew tense with watchfulness, each creak in the floorboards sounding like intrusion. In the courthouse file, a copy of the lab report was stapled to Harold's missing person case. For the first time in a decade, the file bore a new label, reopened. The folder stamped classified was locked away once more. The reopened case drew attention far beyond the township. Reporters from Wichita arrived. Television crews parked vans along the road, and microphones hovered in front of the farmhouse gate. David hated the intrusion but understood its power. Each broadcast forced the sheriff's office to answer questions, and each question circled back to the ledger. Inside the courthouse, clerks hauled boxes of customs and co-op records from the mid-1990s. Nina sat hunched over a desk, scanning brittle pages under fluorescent light. She found irregularities, payment slips missing, pages torn, entire weeks absent from the ledgers filed officially by the cooperative. In their place were gaps, blank spaces where transactions should have been. She held one such record under ultraviolet light borrowed from a technician. Across the page, faint ink appeared. Harold's name, erased but not gone. Forensic staff confirmed the ink was consistent with invisible ultraviolet reactive notations. Someone had entered Harold's payments, then scrubbed them from the record, leaving only faint traces detectable under certain light. It was deliberate erasure, proof that an attempt had been made to hide his debts from official scrutiny. The discovery aligned too neatly with the personal ledger found in the barn. David stared at the glowing words, his father's name shimmering in ultraviolet haze. He felt both vindicated and unsettled, as if the book had been speaking all along, waiting for the right lens to reveal its truths. Nina photographed the pages carefully, storing duplicates off-site, fearing they might vanish like so many other records. Meanwhile, Ortega agreed to give a sworn statement. He described how in 1996, Sheriff Danner had ordered him to set aside suspicious evidence and mark the case inactive. He admitted that the decision had felt wrong, but he lacked authority to resist. His testimony carried weight, tying the silence of the past to official neglect. The sheriff's office now faced scrutiny from the county board. Hearings were called, and David was invited to testify. He brought the ledger in its metal box, unlocking it with steady hands. He placed it on the table, pages splayed to September 17. His voice cracked only once as he read the entry aloud. Meeting, 9:15 p.m., North Pasture. Each word landed like a hammer blow in the hushed room. Outside, Cray grew more defensive. He avoided public spaces, sent his lawyer to speak in his place, and shuttered his co-op office. Yet the pressure mounted. Other farmers came forward, admitting they too had ledger notes in Harold's hand. One described slipping envelopes of cash into Cray's truck under the cover of darkness. Another recalled being threatened with foreclosure if payments fell behind. Their accounts echoed the Whitlow ledger's story. David pieced it together on the kitchen wall. He tacked receipts, photographs, and newspaper clippings beside photocopied pages of the ledger. Red string traced connections, initials to names, dates to payments, payments to threats. The board looked like a map of shadows, the kind investigators once dismissed. Now it stood undeniable. At night, the farmhouse grew tense. A pickup idled at the edge of the property, headlights doused, engine humming low. By the time David stepped outside, the truck sped off, gravel spraying. He logged the event, adding it to the growing file. The forensic story sharpened again when analysts compared the DNA from the shirt scrap to profiles gathered in unrelated county arrests. A partial overlap emerged, familial markers suggesting the donor could be related to Ronald Cray. It was not conclusive, but it narrowed suspicion to his circle. The finding was stapled to the reopened file, further deepening the case against him. Through it all, the ledger remained at the center. What once looked like an ordinary farm account book had become an artifact of power, aligning hidden debts with erasures, personal testimony with scientific traces. Each turn of the page seemed to strip away another layer of silence. By September 2007, nearly 11 years after Harold's disappearance, a grand jury convened. Subpoenas were issued, witnesses summoned. David sat outside the courthouse, the ledger clasped in his hands. He felt the weight of years condensed into its pages, the voice of his father returning line by line. That night, he set the book again on the kitchen table. Martha laid her hand gently on the cover, whispering, "He wrote it so we'd know." The lamp above them flickered once, then steadied. Under ultraviolet light, Harold's name glowed faintly across the erased page. The courthouse air felt different when the whistleblower arrived. She wore a blue coat despite the late spring warmth. Her eyes lowered, her voice steady but restrained. She had worked at the co-op under Cray for more than a decade, filing forms, balancing accounts, logging transactions into official books. When she swore her statement, she admitted that she had seen Harold's name on loan sheets, then watched those entries disappear under orders she dared not question. Her testimony described a pattern. Farmers who fell behind were summoned after dark. Payments were not recorded through proper channels but written on side ledgers Cray kept himself. She remembered Harold leaving the office once, face tight, envelope in his hand. Weeks later, his name was gone from the books. She said she had been told to white out entire lines, then retype sheets for auditors. She never asked why. Nina pressed her afterward for details. The woman hesitated, then handed over a folder she had hidden for years. Inside were photocopies of loan sheets with margins blacked out, names redacted, but faint traces showed through. One page bore Harold's name faintly visible beneath correction fluid. Another carried his signature in pen, but the line had been crossed with heavy ink strokes. Forensic analysts took the sheets under highlight. Infrared imaging revealed what the eye could not. Full entries erased deliberately. On one, the amount matched an identical figure from Harold's barn ledger, $12,200. The connection was irrefutable. David spread the copies across the kitchen table, laying them beside the original ledger. The alignment was precise. Each figure in Harold's hand had its ghost twin in the co-op's redacted books. The ordinary farm ledger had become a mirror, reflecting not just personal debts, but a network of concealment. Meanwhile, the sheriff received an anonymous tape delivered in a plain envelope. The audio carried a male voice, distorted, speaking of removals and settling accounts. At one point, the voice named a place, North Pasture. The recording was short, clipped, its origin untraceable. Technicians said the voice could not be matched conclusively, but the words cut deep. David played it again and again, hearing his father's last entry echoed in a stranger's mouth. The prosecutor added the tape to the growing file. Combined with Ortega's statement, the whistleblower's documents, the DNA trace, and the ledger itself, the case against Cray thickened. Yet he continued to deny involvement, his lawyer issuing statements about vendettas and fabrications. In town, the atmosphere soured. Some defended Cray, insisting the co-op had kept their farms afloat. Others avoided him, eyes down when he passed. The diner became a place of argument, voices rising over coffee cups. Old friendships cracked, families chose sides. The community itself seemed to stand trial alongside Cray. Martha moved through these days like a shadow. She said little, but her eyes lingered on the ledger whenever David opened it. One evening, she touched the final page, tracing the words, "Meeting, 9:15 p.m., North Pasture." Her finger paused over the uneven letters. "He knew it was the end," she whispered. David placed the ledger into an evidence bag, sealing it for the courthouse. It would no longer rest on their kitchen table, but on a prosecutor's desk. The transfer felt like surrender and vindication at once. He signed the chain of custody form, his name inked beneath his father's ghost. At the hearing, the ledger was marked as Exhibit A. Jurors studied its cracked cover, pages stiff with age. Each entry was projected onto a screen. Dates, amounts, initials. The final line filled the room in silence. It was no longer the private scrawl of a farmer, but a public document, a piece of history turned proof. As the whistleblower left the stand, she refused to look at Cray. Her coat brushed the edge of the table, blue fabric swaying. For the first time, David saw fear shift into relief in her posture. A photograph clipped from one file lay on the evidence board. Harold's name half scratched out, letters clawing back into view. The trial convened under a heavy sky in early autumn of 2007. Crowds filled the courthouse, their murmurs pressing against the paneled walls. Farmers in worn jackets, families carrying folded programs from Sunday service, reporters with notepads balanced on their knees, all came to witness the case that had haunted the county for over a decade. At the center of it stood the ledger, tagged as Exhibit A, its cracked leather binding now sealed inside a clear evidence sleeve. David sat at the witness stand first. His hands trembled as he recounted the night in 1996 when his father left the table and never returned. He described finding the truck idling by the barn, the thermos still warm, the cap on the dash. He spoke of years of silence, of the ledger's discovery in the dust, and of the words scrawled on September 17th. Meeting, 9:15 p.m., North Pasture. Each phrase hung in the room like a tolling bell. Martha testified briefly. Her voice was faint but steady as she recalled setting Harold's plate every evening for years. She confirmed his handwriting in the ledger, her recognition immediate and unshakable. She said Harold had never spoken of debts, never admitted strain, but his silence now seemed a shield to spare his family. Ortega followed, his statement firm. He confessed that in 1996, Sheriff Danner had ordered evidence set aside, that he had watched suspicions dismissed, and that he had carried the guilt ever since. His admission drew gasps from the gallery. It was an indictment not only of one man, but of an entire system that had turned away. The prosecution called the handwriting expert from Wichita. She held up enlarged comparisons of the ledger and bank slips, pointing to the slope of the H, the pressure of the pen strokes. Her conclusion was unequivocal. The ledger belonged to Harold. Then came the DNA analyst, describing the shirt scrap, its male genetic profile, and its partial match to the Cray family line. The defense pushed back, suggesting the ledger was circumstantial, the DNA inconclusive, the tape recording fabricated. Cray himself sat rigid, jaw tight, eyes cold. When asked if the initials RC were his, he leaned into the microphone and spat out denials. Yet his composure cracked when the whistleblower in the blue coat took the stand. She recounted the instructions she had received to erase Harold's name from co-op records, to white out figures, to retype clean pages for auditors. She held up the photocopies she had saved, faint names bleeding through correction fluid. Under infrared light, Harold's debts returned like ghosts across the courtroom screen. Cray shifted in his chair, sweat gathering at his collar. The prosecutor played the tape next. The distorted voice filled the room, speaking of removals and settling accounts. When the phrase North Pasture emerged, silence pressed down on every ear. Jurors glanced at one another, some leaning forward, eyes narrowed. Closing arguments traced the story in stark lines. A farmer burdened by debts, drawn into shadow payments, lured to a meeting he never returned from. A community deceived, a family left with silence, and a ledger that waited a decade to speak. The jury deliberated 2 days. When they returned, the foreman rose and spoke a single word: guilty. Cray was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Gasps and sobs filled the room. David gripped his mother's hand, both of them trembling, their faces drawn with relief and sorrow interwoven. Reporters flooded the steps outside. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward. David spoke once, voice steady despite exhaustion. The ledger told the truth. Then he led his mother away, ignoring further questions. That evening, in the farmhouse kitchen, David placed the evidence bag containing the ledger on the table once more. Its surface glimmered under lamplight, no longer just a family object but an artifact of justice. Yet the house did not feel lighter. Harold was still gone. The verdict had given an answer, but not his return. On the courthouse floor, the gavel had fallen, echoing against wood and silence. The farm stood quieter in the months after the verdict. Harvest came and went, rows cut clean across the earth, but the weight of absence never lifted. Neighbors passed by with casseroles and handshakes, some offering apologies for years of silence, others avoiding eye contact. The community itself seemed frayed, trust stripped away. The co-op dissolved under state investigation, its books seized, its offices shuttered. Farmers spoke in bitter tones about how close they had come to the same fate as Harold, and how long their fear had kept them still. David packed his father's belongings from the barn. He boxed rusted tools, folded worn shirts, stacked receipts yellowed by age. In the corner, he found the place where the ledger had rested, shelf warped by dust and time. The emptiness there felt louder than the clutter around it. He touched the groove left behind, the outline of a book that had waited a decade to speak. At the courthouse, the ledger now rested inside an evidence locker, marked with Harold's case number. The tag read, Whitlow vs. Cray, Exhibit A. Its pages were sealed in plastic sleeves, preserved against light and handling. It was no longer the family's to keep, no longer clutter on a shelf, but a permanent artifact in the record of justice. Martha visited once, walking the sterile hallway with a clerk. She asked to see it. When the folder was opened, she placed her hand against the plastic, unable to touch the paper beneath. Her lips trembled as she whispered her husband's name. She left without another word, her footsteps echoing through the corridor. In the months that followed, David found himself haunted not by questions, but by the ledger's final entry. Meeting, 9:15 p.m., North Pasture. He replayed it endlessly, imagining his father walking out across the dark field, thermos steaming in the truck, keys jangling faintly in the open door. He pictured headlights waiting by the fence, voices low, an exchange that turned final. The line had become more than evidence. It was a clock frozen in ink. The farm could not carry the family forever. Martha sold parcels of land, keeping only the house and the yard. David considered leaving, but the soil bound him. Each post and furrow carried his father's weight. He continued to work the remaining fields, but each season felt like an echo. The land produced, but joy never returned. At church, hymns rose again, but some pews sat empty. Those who had defended Cray no longer spoke his name. Those who had remained silent bore their own shame. The trial had ended, but the community carried scars that would not fade. On the 10th anniversary of the verdict, David unlocked a box he kept under his bed. Inside was a photocopy of the ledger, pages stiff and ink faded. He opened to the last entry and stared at the uneven hand. It no longer seemed like a note of business, but a farewell. He closed the book and placed it back inside, sealing the lid. In the end, the ledger had transformed from clutter to confession, from silence to verdict. It carried Harold's hand across years of dust, across the doubts of neighbors, across the walls of a courtroom. It had delivered justice, but it could never bring him back. The last echoes of the case lingered in the barn itself. Wind rattled the empty shelves where the book had once waited, and dust swirled in the narrow light. The silence pressed in, as though the walls themselves remembered what had been lost. The ledger lay sealed, its pages stained with silence.